They told her she'd never sit in the cockpit again. Not after the incident buried in her record. For 5 long years, Ensign Hannah Pressman fixed jets for pilots who never knew her name, watching her dream collect dust on the flight deck. But when the carrier goes dark and a pilot is bleeding out miles from safety, she's the only one left who knows what to do. Even if doing it breaks every rule in the book. What happens when the person they try to ground becomes their last chance in the sky? Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. And be sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story will leave you speechless. Hannah Pressman had long since stopped flinching at the sound of jet engines. They used to make her heart jump, not from fear, but longing. The deep, thunderous growl of an F-18 Super Hornet throttling down the deck had once meant possibility. Now it just meant more maintenance, more checklists, more things she'd fix but never fly. She stood on the deck of the USS Halberd, clipboard tucked under her arm, right hand trailing over the cool metal fuselage of an aircraft that belonged to someone else. Again. Her fingers moved with mechanical precision, checking rivets, seals, panels, not because she was told to, but because it was the only way to stay close to the thing that had been taken from her. She could still remember the moment her flight status had been revoked. One seizure, 10 years ago, in Kentucky, of all places. It wasn't combat-induced, wasn't stress, just dehydration after a crash landing during a routine training sortie. She hadn't blacked out. She hadn't even lost control of the aircraft. But the post-flight report noted the symptoms, and just like that, the Navy decided she was safer turning wrenches than taking off. She'd appealed, naturally, multiple times. Letters, evaluations, private doctors, Navy doctors. Every door closed with the same phrase stamped in red: medically disqualified from flight station. She didn't complain. She didn't throw a fit. Hannah simply kept showing up, kept doing the work, and became one of the best damn technicians in Carrier Air Wing 9. Everyone trusted her with their aircraft, even if they barely spoke to her beyond handing off a checklist. At 29, she was still an ensign, a career bottleneck, but nobody could say she wasn't good at her job. Her signature was on almost every airworthy Hornet that launched from the Halberd. That morning she crouched beside Jet 302, running diagnostics with a handheld that beeped and flickered under the rising sun. Her eyes narrowed at a slight discrepancy in the left side stabilizer's actuator readout. Just a millimeter off. Nothing most would catch. She stood, scribbled a quick note on the clipboard, and turned as Lieutenant Commander Blake Harrow approached from the hangar bay. His flight suit was already zipped halfway, helmet tucked under his arm. There was a faint line of engine grease on his cheekbone, the kind of detail most pilots never carried. "Morning, Pressman," he said, his voice even and unfazed by the chaos of the surrounding deck. Planes being towed, sailors shouting, wheels screeching on steel. Somehow, Harrow always sounded like he was in a calm office, not on a floating weapons platform in the Pacific. "Morning, sir," she replied, not looking up from her notes. "Birds ready?" he asked, nodding toward 302. "She will be in 6 minutes," Hannah replied. "Left stab actuator needs recalibration. It's minor, but you'll feel it in a high-G turn." He paused, then gave a tight nod. "No pushback. No second guessing." "Appreciate the catch," he said. She glanced up at him. Harold had always been different from the other pilots. Not friendlier, necessarily, but aware. He knew every name on the flight deck. He didn't bark orders. He asked questions. Listened. And he never called her River Rat like the others. A nickname born from her crash into a Kentucky river that had cost her more than they'd ever know. Harold moved off to prep with his crew chief, and Hannah returned to the recalibration. Her hands moved without hesitation, adjusting the servo alignment with quiet confidence. She finished just as the deck supervisor barked over the comms to clear the launch line. "Pressman," a voice called over the din, gravelly and clipped. Chief Petty Officer Dan Rourke, weathered, stocky, the kind of guy who could chew through steel and still have room for a cigarette. "Yes, Chief?" He handed her a folded slip of paper. "These came down from Ops. New part inventory for 407, and Marks wants a status report on 311's radar array. Says you've been sitting on it too long." She took the paper, tucking it behind her checklist. "I submitted that report yesterday. He just hasn't read it yet." Rourke grunted. "Tell that to the man himself. Or don't. You know how he gets." She did. Commander Julian Marks was a stickler for protocol, the kind of officer who believed rules were more important than outcomes. She was already on his bad side for working above her rank too often. Taking initiative, in Mark's eyes, was just code for insubordination. She caught sight of him on the starboard side of the deck, arms crossed behind his back, surveying the launch preparations like a chess player watching pawns move. His jaw was tight, uniform perfect, not a bead of sweat on him. She knew that if he had his way, she'd be reassigned to administrative duty on shore. But she wasn't going anywhere, not until someone physically removed her from the halberd, not until she proved, one way or another, that her flight record wasn't the whole story. Back in the maintenance bay, she found a quiet corner beside the parts locker. Pulling out a dog-eared flight manual, she sat cross-legged against the bulkhead and began reviewing engine failure protocols, version 6.3. Old, but useful. She had every page memorized. Still, she studied. A few minutes passed before a shadow fell across her book. "The tradition's obsolete," said a familiar voice. Hannah looked up. Lieutenant Monroe. Kelly. Tall, sharp-eyed, perpetually on the edge of a smirk. She tossed a newer manual down beside her. "Try version 7.1, Monroe said, "unless you're trying to relive the glory days of 8.8. Hannah didn't rise to the joke. She picked up the new manual, flipped through it slowly. Same structure, different margins. Some updated warnings on emergency descent altitudes. "I like to keep my memory sharp," Hannah said. "Memory's not the issue," Monroe replied, more gently now. "But if you're going to dream, might as well dream current." "I'm not dreaming, Lieutenant. I'm preparing." Monroe cocked her head. "For what?" Hannah hesitated. Then, "For when the rules break." That stopped Monroe for a beat. She studied Hannah's face like she was trying to see past the surface. "You don't talk much about it," she said finally. "The crash, the grounding." "Not much to say," Hannah replied. "Engine cut out. Put her down in the water." "Got out?" Monroe raised an eyebrow. "And the seizure?" "Home-time deal. Dehydration. Never happened again." But it was enough. Apparently. They sat there for a moment in silence, the low hum of the carrier beneath them. Monroe stood and slung the newer manual under one arm. "For what it's worth," she said. "I'd fly with you." Hannah looked up sharply, but Monroe was already walking away. She turned back to the manual in her lap. Her fingers hesitated on the edge of a page, then began to flip again, slower now. Outside, the jet engines roared louder. Another flight cycle began, another set of names launching into the sky, and Hannah Pressman sat in the steel belly of the halberd, waiting for the rules to break. The catapult launched Harrow's Hornet into the air with a violent hiss, followed by the trailing scream of afterburners that faded into the horizon. Hannah stood just beyond the yellow safety line, visor down, arms crossed, helmetless beneath her cranial. She watched the aircraft disappear into the layered blue sky with a face carved from stone. She didn't flinch, didn't squint. She had learned to master the look of calm detachment, but her knuckles told a different story, pressed tight enough against her arm to leave crescents in her skin. Crew scurried around her, preparing the next aircraft for launch. Each pilot walking past barely offered her a nod, most not even that. She'd been there for 3 years, and still most of them didn't know she graduated with the same class as some of them. Or maybe they just didn't care. "Pressman!" a voice barked from behind. She turned to see Chief Rourke waving her over, his mustache twitching with impatience. "Stabilizers lagging on 407 again. I want your eyes on it before the next op cycle." She gave a short nod and moved with purpose, ducking under wings and over tie-downs, stepping through pockets of fuel-slicked deck where green shirts rushed to prepare the next launch. Her boots made soft thuds against steel, muffled by the rhythmic thunder of machinery around her. At 407, she climbed onto the service platform and unlatched the access panel. The problem wasn't new, a temperamental control actuator that only misbehaved when the airframe was hot. The others treated it like a ghost in the machine. Hannah treated it like a puzzle. She ran her diagnostics again, faster this time, eyes narrowing at a sensor reading that blinked just a little too rhythmically. "You always look like you're trying to find a heartbeat," came a voice from beside her. She didn't look. She didn't have to. "Lieutenant Commander Harrow," she said. "Blake," he corrected, not for the first time. "We're not in a briefing." She glanced at him sideways. "Is this a briefing?" "Nope," he replied casually. "This is me being nosy." She focused back on the panel. "I'm recalibrating the heat dampening filter again. You ever think about commissioning for engineering?" She closed the panel and hopped down. "I didn't go to flight school to write manuals." He followed her, helmet still in hand, hair wind-tossed from the flight. "I looked into your old evals," he said, softer now. "The med board's ruling. It was based on a single EEG after your crash, wasn't it?" She stiffened. "You went digging through my record." "Didn't need to dig, just needed to read." She stared at him then, for a beat too long. The wind caught a loose strand of her hair and whipped it across her face, and she tucked it behind her ear like it was the only thing keeping her from snapping. "Doesn't matter," she said finally. "The ink's dry. I'm not getting reinstated." Blake's expression didn't change. He just gave her a slow nod. "But for the record," he added, "if I were in a burning jet with no nav, no instruments, and no backup, I'd want you in the other seat." He turned and walked off without waiting for her reaction. She didn't move for several seconds after he left. A crew member called her name, but it sounded distant, almost underwater. She swallowed and pushed it all down again, like always. Later that evening, she sat alone in the mess hall with her tray untouched and a maintenance tablet in front of her, flipping through system readouts and internal sensor feedback. Her fingers worked out of habit, eyes moving quickly across the digital schematics, correcting minor diagnostic errors without really thinking about them. Across the room, pilots gathered near the back tables, swapping stories in the usual loud, cocky tones. Their laughter rose and fell like a wave, cresting over the sterile hum of the overhead lights. No one sat near her. They never did. She wasn't one of them. Not anymore. Maybe never was. She flipped to a file labeled Tactical Recovery Protocols, Rev 4.1, scanning through procedures with her fork still untouched on the tray beside her. "You ever eat?" Monroe's voice came from just behind her shoulder. Hannah didn't turn. Eventually, Monroe slid into the seat across from her, plopping her tray down like she'd been expected. "You know, they say the mess food's bad, but it's not cold meatloaf 3 hours later bad," she quipped. "I've had worse," Hannah replied. Monroe stabbed a green bean with calculated violence. "You know, some of the pilots call you Hangar Ghost." Hannah's jaw clenched, but she said nothing. "I tell them it's a lazy nickname," Monroe continued. "You're not a ghost. You're a loaded weapon with the safety on. Better than being called deadweights." Monroe leaned back. "They're wrong, you know. We all know you were screwed. Is it supposed to make me feel better?" "No," Monroe said, suddenly serious. It's supposed to remind you that your story isn't finished yet." Before Hannah could respond, a low rumble passed through the deck beneath their feet. It wasn't an explosion, but something about it felt wrong, like a pulse that wasn't in rhythm. Both women paused, instinctively listening. A voice crackled over the internal comm system. It was brief, unintelligible at first. Then another voice, firmer, more direct. "Flight operations temporarily suspended. Stand by for further instruction." The chatter in the mess hall quieted. Even the pilots at the back lowered their voices. Monroe was already halfway out of her seat. Something's not right. Hannah stood too, her eyes focused, alert. They reached the hallway as crew members rushed past in coordinated urgency. One of the IT techs bumped into Monroe's shoulder and muttered an apology without stopping. "Comms are acting up," he said. "We're on backup routing." In the bay, power flickered overhead. Consoles rebooted mid-use. Red lights blinked where green should have been. The hum of auxiliary systems began to override the usual deck noise, a quiet alarm buried beneath the surface, like the ship was holding its breath. Chief Rourke emerged from below deck, jaw clenched, eyes sweeping the room. "Al flight lines, hold position," he barked. "All non-essential ops stand down. Report any electrical irregularities directly to CI." "Is it a drill?" Hannah asked, moving to intercept him. "No," he muttered. "This isn't a damn drill." She looked around. The air felt heavier now, like the ship itself was bracing for something. The hangar lights dimmed once, briefly, just long enough for everyone to notice, just long enough to make the silence that followed feel unnatural. Then came the call from the bridge, clipped, urgent, but steady. "Possible electronic warfare disruption. All systems under evaluation. Power cycling initiated. Carrier battle group shifting to condition yellow." Hannah and Monroe locked eyes. Monroe exhaled. "They're jamming us, or testing how blind we can get," Hannah whispered. A sharp voice over the overhead broke the moment. "Commander Marks. All unauthorized personnel clear the bay. Repeat, this is not a drill. Report to your stations and await further instruction." But Hannah wasn't moving. Not yet. Because something in her gut told her this was the moment she'd been waiting for. Not hoping for, not exactly, but preparing for. Silently, relentlessly. And if she was right, the glass ceiling wasn't the only thing about to shatter. Lieutenant Commander Blake Harrow had seen malfunction protocols before. He drilled through blackouts, power drops, and isolated jamming simulations dozens of times. But this wasn't a simulation. This wasn't scheduled. And as he stood in the Combat Information Center, watching the radar screens flicker like dying stars, he felt something tighten deep in his chest. The kind of instinct born not from fear, but repetition. Something was very, very wrong. "L systems cycling to backup," one of the technicians reported, voice forced calm. "Primary radar offline, comm line still unstable. Sat link is down." "Navigation," Marks demanded, stepping forward from his place near the tactical display, his voice sharper than usual. "Dead. GPS signals being scrambled. Can't lock to anything. We're flying blind, sir." "Try relinking the secure channel through surface bounce," Marks ordered. "Use the EHF." "We've tried." "They're jamming that too." Harrow stepped closer, lowering his voice. "What about the Hawkeyes? Any word?" "Negative," another tech answered. "Airborne early warning birds are not responding." It was then that the lights dimmed. Not all the way, but enough to send a pulse of unease through every man and woman in the room. The fluorescent tubes overhead dropped into a soft reddish hue, bathing the CIC in the dull glow of standby power. A beat passed in silence. Then came the call from flight deck control. "Commander, we've got a man down in the air. Call sign Reaper 2. Eject sequence was triggered mid-patrol. Last ping shows him near grid quadrant Charlie 9er, deep water. He's alive, but drifting." Marks froze. "Who?" "Captain Vandross." The name landed like a weight. Vandross wasn't just any pilot. He was the squadron leader, Harrow's mentor, and the one man aboard with more flight hours logged than anyone else on the Halberd. If he was down and drifting out of signal, they were already behind. "Do we have any aircraft ready to launch?" Marks asked, voice clipped. "No, sir. Catapults are offline. Launch systems are dead weight without main power. Then we'll recover him after we're back online." "How long?" Harrow asked quietly. Marks didn't look at him. "As long as it takes." Harrow took a breath, the kind of breath that steadied a cockpit in turbulence. "If we wait," he said, "we lose him." Marks turned to him. "Lieutenant Commander, you'll speak when spoken to." "With respect, sir," Harrow said, squaring his shoulders. "I'm not letting a man drown just because protocol tells us to sit tight." "It's not protocol, it's survival," Marks snapped. "You try to launch right now and you risk killing 2 men instead of 1. I will not allow rogue action on my deck." Harrow clenched his jaw but said nothing else. The order had been given. Down below, the flight deck simmered with restrained chaos. Planes were frozen in place, half-prepped. The catapults stood silent. Crew members gathered near tie-downs and equipment lockers, awaiting instructions that weren't coming fast enough. Hannah Pressman moved through them like a ghost. Not rushing, calculating. She'd heard the call from CIC, Reaper 2. She'd only spoken to Vandross once, but she'd worked on his bird nearly every week. She knew its quirks, its sounds, its flight time. Now it was just floating somewhere out there, and no one was moving. She found herself near the stern elevator where Blake stood at the edge of the deck, staring out into the growing dark. The sky was still blue, but the horizon felt off, hollow. He didn't turn as she stepped up beside him. "They're not going to launch," she said softly. "Nope. They'll wait for authorization, even if he's gone by then." "Yep." She looked out into the sea, searching for something she couldn't see. "You'd go, wouldn't you?" she asked. He turned to look at her now. "Yeah, if I could. If they'd let me." She didn't respond, just stared out into the void, her expression unreadable. Then she turned on her heel and walked away without another word. Back in the maintenance bay, she moved fast. Pulled up schematics, checked the last maintenance logs on 302, a Hornet she knew inside and out. She had just replaced its forward avionics bay a week ago. Everything was in top condition. Fuel was still loaded. Batteries were good. She scanned the instruments. External power was off, but she could hot start if she bypassed the power relay manually. It would mean overriding the startup sequence. Not recommended, but not impossible. Chief Rourke found her 10 minutes later, kneeling beneath the nose cone with a diagnostic line running from her tablet. "You getting ready for something I don't know about?" he asked. She didn't look up. "Just making sure 312's warm, in case someone needs it. To someone like you. Someone who knows how to fly and doesn't care what Mark says." He stared at her. The silence between them stretched long enough to feel heavy. "I knew this day was coming," he said finally. She looked up at him. "You've been flying on the ground ever since they clipped your wings," he continued. "One of these days I figured you'd stop pretending." She stood slowly, brushing her hands on her flight coveralls. "I need 15 more minutes," she said. "Can you cover the bay?" Rourke stared at her for a long time, then nodded once. "I'll make sure no one sees what they don't want to see." She moved like a shadow now, prepping the aircraft without any of the usual steps. No checklists, no crew, no air boss. Just muscle memory, grit, and a defiance she'd kept hidden for 5 long years. Blake stood on the deck when the sound of the jet's engines spun to life. At first, he thought it was a glitch. Then he saw it. 312, rolling toward the launch line under its own power, flaps moving in quick bursts. He caught a glimpse of the pilot inside, helmeted, visor down. He didn't need to see the name stenciled on the side to know who it was. He ran. The plane reached the forward catapult, and Hannah brought it to a stop. She keyed the internal comms, praying auxiliary would hold long enough. "Pressman to tower, I'm taking this bird up. I know the risks, but if we let Vandross drift, we're no better than the current pulling him under. I'll bring him home, or I won't come back, but you don't get to stop me." No one responded. No denial, no confirmation, just silence. Then, miraculously, the catapult hydraulics hissed to life. Not full power, just enough. Somewhere, someone had opened the manual feed valve, and she knew exactly who. She gripped the throttle, pushed forward, and the jet launched into the sky, a single blue and gray bullet cutting through the failing light, alone. No backup, no radio, no net to catch her. But she wasn't flying blind. Not this time. Not anymore. Lake Harrow stood at the edge of the flight deck, wind snapping at his sleeves, eyes fixed on the speck disappearing into the clouds. The roar of the F-18's engines faded into the vast silence, leaving only the hum of the ship's crippled systems and the pounding of blood in his ears. He didn't need to ask where the authorization had come from, because it hadn't. That launch was rogue. It was reckless. It was exactly what he would have done. He turned and marched toward the tower, ducking past startled crewmen, past an air boss still fumbling with a dead headset, past red shirts frozen mid-tack. The tower was chaos, officers shouting, consoles dim, emergency lights painting everything in the dull haze of warning. Commander Marks stood in the center of it all, jaw clenched so tight the veins in his neck stood out like cables under pressure. "She took a jet," Mark snapped the moment he saw Harrow enter. "Your friend, Pressman." "She's not my. You were with her on the deck. Don't insult me by pretending you didn't know." "I didn't know," Harrow said, but the lie was thin. "And if I had, I'd have backed her." "You'd have joined her," Marks corrected, stepping forward. "Let me be clear, Lieutenant Commander. This is a direct violation of operational protocol under current condition status. She has stolen a Navy aircraft. She's not even cleared to fly." "She was cleared once. That's ancient history." "She's the best shot you have at recovering Vandross," Harrow said, voice rising, "and we both know it." Marks turned away and pressed his palms to the edge of the console, his fingers twitching with restraint. "She is flying blind in contested airspace, with no radio, no GPS, no air support, and no recovery grid. That's not courage, Harrow. That's suicide. She didn't go up there to die." "And what happens if she's shot down?" Marks asked, wheeling on him again. "What happens if we lose 2 pilots instead of 1? What happens when the Chinese pick up that jet and turn this into a diplomatic disaster?" Blake's silence was answer enough. Marks took a breath, steadied himself, and lowered his voice. "We will prepare for recovery. If she survives this madness, she will be arrested upon landing. You can count on that." Blake stepped forward, quiet but firm. "If she comes back with Vandross, sir, I dare you to court-martial her in front of this crew." Mark's nostrils flared, but he didn't respond. He turned his back instead. Down on the deck, Chief Rourke stood beside the empty catapult track, arms crossed over his chest, a wrench still in his hand like he couldn't quite remember where he was supposed to put it. Around him, flight deck crew had resumed their tasks, though slower, more deliberate. Some of them glanced up at the sky. Others looked at the vacant spot where Jet 312 had sat just minutes ago. It was like a ghost had launched itself into the void. Monroe approached from the elevator, breath short from running. "She did it," she said. "She actually did it. She's been waiting 5 years to prove she could," Rourke replied, without looking at her. Monroe followed his gaze. "Is there even a plan to get her back on deck?" "Not yet. And when the CO finds out you helped her?" "I didn't help her," Rourke said. Monroe gave him a sideways look. "I just didn't stop her." In the air, Hannah Pressman flew with a stillness that could only come from familiarity, her hands steady on the stick, her feet dancing with just the right pressure on the rudder pedals. The cockpit lights flickered once but held. Her HUD was blank, radar was dead. She flew by instinct, by horizon line, by the whisper of the airframe and the rhythm of the engines. It was dangerous. It was maddening. But it was also the most alive she'd felt in years. The last time she'd flown solo was a decade ago, a training run over the Appalachians. The day everything had changed. She remembered the way the engine had sputtered mid-climb, how she'd fought to keep the bird aloft, how she'd leveled it out long enough to make a controlled ditch into the Kentucky River. She'd walked away soaked, shaking, but otherwise fine. The Navy had called it a miracle. Then the report came in. Seizure. Flight disqualification. Appeal denied. She hadn't blacked out. She hadn't lost control. She'd lost trust. Until now. The ocean spread below her in a vast, indifferent sheet of gray boo. Somewhere down there, Vandross was drifting. She keyed the emergency homing scanner, hoping, praying the beacon had survived ejection. Static hissed through the system. Then, faintly, a ping. Weak. Fading. She adjusted her heading. Every second counted now. On the halberd, the command team scrambled to coordinate potential recovery. Power was slowly returning in patches. One of the generators was operational again, enough to get partial radar online. They'd picked up Hannah's transponder, barely, and had tracked her on a westward heading. "Captain Vandross's beacon just activated," an ensign called out. "Very faint. Looks like she's narrowing in." Marks said nothing. He just stared at the display. Harrow leaned over the console. "Let me prep a second bird. You're not going anywhere. If she needs help." "She won't get it from you," Marks snapped. Harrow asked. "Because she's better at this than we are?" Marks didn't respond. His silence said everything. Somewhere between pride and protocol, he'd made his decision. And he wasn't turning back. Outside, the ocean shifted under dimming skies. Twilight pressed in around the floating carrier. Red lights glowed along the flight deck. The catapults were still offline, but the arresting cables had been manually realigned by Rourke's crew. No auto-calibration, no indicator lights, just guesswork and a prayer. And Rose stood near the flight control console now, watching the numbers update. Altitude, fuel, velocity. Hannah's jet was dropping in altitude. "She's coming back," she said. "Already?" Rourke asked. "Did she find him?" Monroe pointed at the second blip on the screen. Another beacon. Vandross's ejection chair. "She's not just coming back, she's bringing him with her." Somewhere far above the ocean, Hannah's voice cracked through over the emergency channel. Barely a whisper through the static. "Albert, this is Pressman. I have Captain Vandross. He's stable but unconscious. Request emergency tramp landing. I have 30% fuel. No HUD, no arrestor guidance." In the tower, every head turned toward Marks. He didn't speak. He just nodded. The flight deck buzzed to life. Deck crew scrambled into position. Yellow shirts signaled with flashlights instead of panels. The landing officer stepped into place, radio crackling in his ear. Harrow stood at the edge, eyes locked on the darkening sky. Then, like a ghost out of the night, 312 emerged. Low, fast, wobbling just slightly. Landing gear extended, flaps down. A second canopy visible just behind hers, fogged over but intact. The F-18 dipped once, then leveled. The cable caught on the third hook. Sparks flashed. Rubber screamed. Then the jet stopped, realizing dead center. Silence fell over the deck. Then came the sound of cockpits opening. Two figures, one rising steady, one slumped, unconscious. She stood, helmet under her arm, sweat pouring down her temples, and stared at the crew gathering around the aircraft. No one spoke. No one moved. until Blake Harrow stepped forward and saluted. Not mockingly, not softly, a full, proper salute. Others followed, even Rourke, with grease still on his palms. And finally, slowly, Commander Marks, standing above them all, raised his hand in salute. Hannah didn't smile, she just nodded once, and walked off the deck as the pilot she'd always been. The medics moved fast. Vandross was wheeled away on a stretcher before his boots even touched the deck. The crew made space, clearing a path in seconds, their voices subdued, like reverence had taken hold of everyone at once. No one said it, but they all felt it. The impossible had just happened. Hannah Pressman, the technician no one trusted in the air, had flown a solo blackout mission, recovered their squadron commander, and landed on a silent carrier with nothing more than instinct and grit. It didn't feel real. She stepped off the wing of the Hornet, helmet tucked under one arm, her boots clicking softly against the non-skid steel. Her flight suit was soaked through with sweat. Her fingers trembled. No one would have noticed if she collapsed right there, knees hitting the deck out of sheer exhaustion. But she didn't. Every observation post looked for her as she accelerated. The helmet idled and tilted until she weaved. She walked with purpose, not hurried, not proud, just done. As she passed the rows of sailors and deckhands and officers who had gathered without really knowing why, a hush settled. Nobody knew what the next move was. Should they cheer? Applaud? Pretend this hadn't broken half the regulations in the fleet manual? No one moved until Harrow caught up to her, stepping into her path like he was afraid she might vanish into thin air if he let her go too far. "You good?" he asked, quietly. "I will be," she said. "You saved his life." She didn't answer. Her eyes were already scanning the deck, looking for the next fire to put out, the next excuse to stay busy and not think too much about what had just happened. "You're not grounded anymore," Harris said. That stopped her. She looked at him like the words didn't make sense. He added, "There's no going back from this. Everyone saw what you did." "Doesn't mean they'll change the rules," she said. "Maybe not," he admitted, "but they'll change their minds." She didn't nod, didn't smile, just kept walking. Inside the carrier, the chain of command was unraveling in whispers. Commander Marks stood in his office, hands braced on his desk, staring down at a printout of Hannah's transponder path. Her flight had no assistance, no instrumentation. Her trajectory into blackout airspace had been pure judgment, and her return had pushed the aircraft's specs to the limit. There was no protocol for this, no regulation that told him how to respond. He could court-martial her. He had every right. And yet, his intercom buzzed. "Sir, Admiral Kinney is on the line from Fleet Command, Priority 2. Marks straightened. "Put her through." A crackle, then the voice came in clear. "Commander Marks, you have some explaining to do." "Yes, Admiral. I just received an emergency brief. One of your enlisted personnel, one not cleared for flight, executed an unsanctioned launch during an EW blackout. She retrieved a downed pilot and returned safely to a dark deck with 0 fatalities. Is this accurate?" "It is. I want her name." "Hannah Pressman, ma'am." "Ensign." The line went quiet for a beat. Then, "Is there a reason she wasn't flying before today?" Marks exhaled slowly. "There was a medical disqualification in her record, a prior incident. She's been working as an aviation tech." "Well, I'm not in the habit of second-guessing past decisions," Kinney said, "but if you court-martial this girl, you'll be explaining that to the Senate subcommittee that funds our next-generation carrier project." "I understand." "Good. I'll expect your full report by 600. And, Commander?" "Yes, ma'am?" "You've got yourself one hell of a pilot." The line went dead. In the wardroom later that evening, the flight officers sat around the table, unusually quiet for a group that usually laughed too loud and cursed too often. Harrell, Munro, and a few others watched as Rourke dropped into a seat with a grunt, and a coffee mug half full of something definitely not coffee. "She really did it," someone said from the end of the table. "She flew it clean." "Better than clean," Rourke replied. "She flew it like she never should have been grounded." Munro leaned forward. "So what now? They just hand her wings back?" "No one just hands you anything," Rourke said, "especially not in this outfit. But they can't ignore it." Harrow tapped a finger against his mug. "They won't. Admiral Kinney knows already. My guess is the ink's drying on the reversal paperwork by morning." Someone let out a low whistle. "Would you fly with her?" another pilot asked, directing it at Harrow. "In a heartbeat," he replied. In the hangar bay, Hannah was alone again. The others had scattered after the adrenaline wore off. She'd refused the medics, refused the mess. She just needed quiet. She sat cross-legged beside the jet she'd flown, her hand resting gently against the fuselage like she was thanking it. The sound of footsteps echoed. She didn't have to look up. "Marks," she said. He stopped beside her, standing stiffly, hands clasped behind his back. "You disobeyed direct orders," he said. "I did." "You launched a combat aircraft without clearance." "And I did." "You risked an international incident?" "Yes, sir." A pause. "And you saved a man's life." She looked up at him. Marks let out a breath. "There's going to be fallout. There always is. You may be a symbol now," he added, more softly, "but that doesn't mean people will suddenly like you." "I'm not here to be liked," she said. "I've noticed." He let the silence settle. Then he said something she didn't expect. "You belong up there." She blinked. Slowly. He continued. "You're not a mechanic playing pretend. You're a pilot, one of the best I've ever seen." It was the closest thing to an apology she would ever get. She nodded. "Thank you." He turned to go, but stopped halfway. "I'll see you at the morning brief," he said. "You're putting me back on the flight roster?" He glanced over his shoulder. "I'm not doing anything." And then he left. In the barracks that night, her bunk was covered in flight manuals and post-it notes and scribbled diagrams she'd made over the years, almost ritualistically. She swept them into her arms and dropped them into her locker without ceremony. She didn't need them anymore. She had memorized every emergency protocol, every maneuver, every checklist, not for survival, but for the hope that someday someone would call her bluff and give her a chance. Now they had, and she hadn't missed. She pulled the small wooden box from the bottom of the locker, the one she hadn't opened in years. Inside were the civilian pilot wings she'd earned before the Navy, a photo of her beaming in front of a tiny training plane, and a folded letter of recommendation from her first flight instructor, faded and creased at the corners. She added something new, her name tag from her tech uniform, and she closed the lid. Tomorrow she'd wear a flight suit with a pilot's patch again, and this time no one would take it from her. The next morning arrived without fanfare. No trumpets, no ceremonies, just the metallic groan of hatches opening and the buzz of sailors starting another day on the USS Halberd. But something had changed. Quietly, palpably. It was in the way crew members nodded a little longer when Hannah Pressman passed by, how conversations paused for a split second when she entered a room. She wasn't the mechanic anymore, not the hangar ghost, not the grounded flyer. She was the woman who launched into a blackout sky and brought one of their own home. And everyone knew it. She stood in front of the mirror in the women's locker room, adjusting the zipper on her flight suit. It felt heavier than she remembered, weighted with years she didn't yet know how to unpack. The new patch sewn to her chest didn't say maintenance division anymore, it said pilot. Her fingers paused over it, tracing the stitching, like it might vanish if she blinked too long. The door creaked open behind her and Munro stepped in, already halfway into her own flight gear. "You clean up all right," Monroe said, flashing a grin. Hannah gave a dry smile. "Almost forgot how these suits fit." "Like a second skin and a bad idea," Monroe replied. "You ready?" "Am I allowed to say no?" "Not if you want to keep that patch." They left together, their boots echoing down the corridor toward the ready room. Inside, Harrow leaned against the far wall, sipping stale coffee with the calm of a man who'd seen every disaster and miracle the sea could throw at him. When Hannah entered, he gave a slow nod, respectful, but no longer surprised. He'd known she'd be back in that room eventually. The only question had been, when? A few heads turned, then quickly turned back. She didn't mind. Let them look. Commander Marks entered through the side hatch, his uniform crisp, posture as rigid as ever. He stepped up to the front and tapped the screen that would begin the day's mission briefing. "Good morning," he said, voice neutral. "Let's get to it." But then he paused. His eyes scanned the room and landed on her. "Before we begin," he said, "I want to address what happened yesterday." The room stiffened. Harrow straightened. Monroe shifted in her seat. Marks continued. "As you all know, Ensign Hannah Pressman launched an unsanctioned F-18 recovery mission in violation of multiple regulations. She did so during a blackout event, without comms, without arrestor cable assistance, and with no backup. She recovered Captain Vandross alive and returned to this deck under conditions most of us would not have attempted." Silence. Then, "Fleet Command has reviewed the incident. The recommendation from Admiral Kinney was clear. No disciplinary action is to be taken. Effective immediately, Ensign Pressman is reinstated to active flight status. She will resume duties under Air Wing 9. The room didn't explode into applause, but it didn't need to. Respect doesn't shout, it lingers. Harrow leaned toward her and murmured, "Told you, ink's dry." Marks finished the brief like nothing had happened. Orders were given, flight patterns updated, assignments handed out, and at the bottom of the list, one name sat where it hadn't been for years. Pressman H-Jet 312 Potno. Patrol 900. Afterward, she stepped out onto the deck and let the wind slap against her face. The salt air. The sound of turbines spinning to life. The smell of hydraulic fluid and steel. Everything she'd missed. Everything she'd been forced to stand beside instead of inside. Chief Rourke approached, hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Flight line says she's ready," he said, nodding toward 312. "Cleaned her up for the occasion." "She always did prefer a dramatic comeback," Hannah replied. Rourke studied her a second longer, then handed her a small cloth bundle. She unfolded it and found her old pilot wings, the ones they'd taken from her, boxed away, stored in a personnel drawer somewhere and likely forgotten. Someone had polished them. They gleamed. "I told him I'd walk off this ship before I saw you fly again," Rourke said with a grunt. "Guess I'm eating my words. You're still here." "Yeah, well, it turns out I'm stubborn." She smiled and pinned the wings just above her patch. "Go make us look good," Rourke said, then walked away before she could thank him. She climbed into the cockpit like she'd never left it. The seat molded to her back. The canopy hissed as it lowered. The systems came to life beneath her fingers. This time, nothing flickered. Nothing failed. The catapult crew signaled green. Launch systems fully restored, no backup valves, no manual overrides. It was official. She belonged here. The engines roared. The carrier shifted beneath her. And in the span of a heartbeat, she was airborne, thrown into the sky with the grace and fury only the Hornet could deliver. Above the clouds, she leveled out. The radar blinked. The HUD pulsed steady. The world stretched wide, unbroken and blue. She keyed the comms. "Halberd Control, this is Reaper 3. In position, heading north by northeast. Instruments clean. Fuel full. Feels good to be back." A pause. Then the tower responded. "Reaper 3, welcome home." She banked gently, letting the jet glide with the wind for a moment. Somewhere far below, the sea kept moving, unaware. Ships and storms and orders would come and go, but for now, up here, she was free. Not just flying, soaring. Not because someone allowed her to, but because she'd taken it. She reached into the side compartment of her flight vest and pulled out a folded photo, a grainy image of her and her father, taken in front of a civilian prop plane when she was 17. He taught her how to fly long before the Navy ever knew her name. She tapped the photo twice and tucked it back into the vest. Then, with steady hands, she pulled into a wide arc, the sunlight glinting off her wings, painting her silhouette across the sky. Back on the carrier, Monroe watched from the catwalk with a smirk. "He's writing her own playbook now," she said. Harrow stepped beside her, arms folded, sunglasses low on his nose. "She always was," he replied. "We just finally caught up." In the tower, Mark set down his clipboard and looked out the window at the dot carving perfect loops across the open sky. And for the first time in a long time, he smiled. Somewhere in the static of memory, in the pages of regulations and reports and disqualifications, the Navy had made a mistake, and Hannah Pressman had rewritten it in contrails and courage. Above the roar of the ocean, the scream of the turbines, and the distant pulse of war and peace, and all the gray in between, one truth stood clear. She was never grounded. She was only waiting for the sky to call her name again. And this time, the sky answered.